In this discussion, we will discuss the discussion question of describe how to decide the best allocation basis to use to allocate indirect costs. When we see a discussion question like this or an essay question like this, our goal typically is to write more rather than less in order to pick up as many points as possible. Typically with an essay question, if we write more and if we have the time to allow to do that, we're more likely to pick up parts of the answer that are necessary to get full credit. And if we write too much, that usually doesn't mark us off for writing too much. And in a discussion question, our goal is typically to add to the discussion, and expanding is usually a component of that. Keeping that in mind, let's go through this again. Describe how to decide the best allocation basis to use to allocate indirect costs. So the first thing we might want to do here is take a step back once again and say, well, indirect costs, that sounds like a managerial accounting term as opposed to a financial accounting term, which means that we're focused here on managerial or internal type of decision making as opposed to external investor or external decision making, which is the major goal of the compilation of the financial statements for financial accounting. So we have indirect costs. That's going to be a managerial accounting term. We're going to try to break out the costs in some type of format a bit different than we typically see in financial accounting. So the indirect cost is one way that we'll do this. We do this many different ways in managerial accounting. Indirect cost is one way to do that. So the idea here, or what they're asking for, is the allocation of indirect costs. We may first want to define then what indirect costs are, and we can compare and contrast indirect costs to direct costs. Direct costs are going to be those costs that we can assign directly to a department. They're going to be costs that are incurred within a department. You can give examples for these types of costs. For example, a salary of an employee that works directly within a department can clearly be traced to that individual department. An indirect cost, on the other hand, is a cost that basically is going to be the benefit of the company, but benefits multiple different departments. So we're paying for it at a level higher than the department, but it's benefiting multiple departments. Therefore, if we want to allocate it to those departments to measure performance better in some format, we're going to have to use some allocation method to use. So in other words, we have to allocate the cost out in some way between the departments. We need to do that in some format. You might then first guess, if we were thinking of how to do this, how could we allocate the costs of indirect costs to multiple departments? Well, we could take the cost and divide it by the number of departments we need to allocate to. That would be one way to do it, but that would be an even allocation. Might not be the best way to allocate because some departments might be bigger than others, or they might use the costs in different proportions, and therefore that wouldn't be a very fair allocation. Now note, the goal of the allocation is to basically be able to measure the performance of the departments in some way. We're going to be looking at this. We're going to be making departmental income statements and basically measuring how people are doing in each department. And so therefore, the allocation needs to be thought of as fair. So when we think about people running the different departments, whatever we're going to be using in order to judge people on these numbers, the people being judged needs to be able to look at these numbers and say, I believe this is fair, because that's going to increase morale. If they look at the numbers and the allocation basis and they say, wow, this doesn't make any sense, we're being, treated unfairly, or even we're being treated too fairly, but it's clear that these numbers are meaningless in some way because the allocation basis is completely off track with any kind of relevant decision-making process, then of course the morale of the company, the people that feel like they're not being judged based on a fair basis, is going to go down. What we want to do is we want to allocate things as fairly as possible so that we can make the fairest amount of judgment to people, hold people accountable in a fair way so that they can look at the process and say, hey, even if I didn't do as well here, I feel the process is right. So what we need to do then is find some type of allocation base that makes better sense than just dividing it out. Usually we'll use some type of allocation basis to do that, a ratio of some type of allocation basis. Now, we could do this fairly simply and have like one allocation basis that we use to allocate a lot of different costs, or we could take all the indirect costs each individually and break them out and find the best allocation base to allocate out the cost. There's no one set rule to fit all companies. We have a balancing act between trying to find a basis, a form of allocation that is fair as possible, and one that's somewhat simple, doesn't cost too much for us to break out and get that more information, and is something that we can explain to people so that they understand why we're breaking this out in this format, or why we're using this basis. So some typical types of basis we might use is something like the square footage. For example, if we were to say that we had the rent or the utilities of a company, of a building that's going to be allocated to multiple different departments, then we might say, well, how are we going to allocate this out? Well, one way is we can take the relative square footage of the building and then allocate out use the ratio of the square footage to allocate the costs of the rent or the utilities to the different departments. Now, it could get more complex than that. It might be that different parts of the building have different relative values and whatnot. And so that could still be too simplified in some ways, and there could be discussion on how to complicate that. But that's one kind of allocation basis that would typically be used. Other types of allocations could be something like if we're allocating the service department of, say, maintenance or something like that to multiple departments. We could use like the employees maybe. We could, again, use square footage. We could use the number of employees that are in each department, because the ratio of each employee might be a good allocation base for certain types of costs that we can then allocate, because those costs would be more costly, you would think, by the number of employees that are going to be within the company or within that process. Another common allocation base is sales. So we can look at the sales for the multiple different departments. We can take a ratio analysis of those different sales numbers and use those percentages in order to allocate different costs. So again, there's no one size fits all. There's no one way to do it. It's managerial accounting, and managerial accounting means we have best practices, and then we try to work with those best practices to fit within our particular organization. And we can use multiple different allocation bases to do that. Our goal is to find the allocation base that's going to be most applicable and have the most relevant kind of allocation of the costs, so that people, when they are judged based on that allocation within each department, feel that the allocation is fair, which means that the allocation needs to be as fair as possible, and it needs to be something that we can explain. All that in consideration also needs to be considered in terms of the cost-benefit analysis of the different types of allocation bases and the complexity that we are using for it.